All right, so today's video is going to be a very important topic. It's something that I personally have struggled with a ton in the past, and it's something that people don't explain in the fitness industry for whatever reason. It's something that basically nobody talks about. So I figured I would help a lot of you guys when it comes to what's actually important for hypertrophy training that a lot of people just don't focus on, and people just don't talk about it. And I think people don't quite understand it, and I think that's why it's not talked about that much. So before I get into everything, obviously a lot of you guys have spent a lot of time watching fitness content, whether it's Instagram or YouTube or whatever. And at the end of the day, you see a lot of people that just kind of hammer home this idea of progressive overload and how it's the end all be all. And while it's super important, I think the most important thing to focus on is the accumulation of volume, regardless of if it's a progression or not, and at least in the short term. And I'm going to explain the difference between short-term progressions and long-term progressions and why one isn't quite as important as the other one. And I want to explain what you should be focusing on instead of just worrying about progressing every single session, because that's just not how it works. And I'm not just going to tell you that linear gains aren't possible or don't focus on linear gains. I'm going to explain to you why you can't make linear gains and why there's actually things that cause you to not make linear gains. So what I want you guys to have as a mindset is accumulation of volume as the focus of your training. If you're looking to build muscle, you need to be accumulating sets. Like if you have just like a backlog of all the sets that you've done, you need to keep adding to it. You need to keep building that, keep doing your sets, get that in. That's the top priority. If you have a training day that day, and you don't progress, don't think that's a waste of time, because you're adding volume to the tank. You're putting that into your training history. You're building off of it. Whether you progressed from last time or not, or progressed from last week or not, it just doesn't matter in the short term. Getting the work in for bodybuilding is by far the most important thing. With that being said, progression, mainly in the long term, is the accountability that you're actually training hard. If you're not progressing at all, you're probably doing something wrong. And that's basically an indication that you should be reflecting on your training and saying, am I doing everything properly? Is my volume okay? Is my proximity to failure okay? I could go on forever about every training variable, but that's besides the point. So the first point that I really want to get into is getting your volume in is always going to beat minor day-to-day progressions. And I do want to dive a little bit deeper into this. So what I did for this video, the first one's going to be misconceptions when it comes to progression, when it comes to accumulation of volume. Second point is going to be why day-to-day progression and constant progression isn't actually the best focus, and why it's not really possible, and why it actually gets affected in ways that we don't really think that it does. And I want to offer you guys like a solution and what you should focus on, and then the actual mindset to finish everything off. As you guys know, I'm pretty big on mindset with this stuff. So the misconception is that progressive overload needs to happen every session in order to grow. That's definitely a misconception. That's something that I've fallen for a ton. I have a couple clients that are kind of in that situation right now, that are worried about not progressing day to day or week to week. And that's totally fine. It's a very normal thing to think if you regress, maybe you're not making progress, you're not training hard enough, something's wrong, let's change the program entirely. Certainly not the case, and I want to explain to you the bigger picture here. So let me dive into a little bit of a debunking of that statement. So this isn't true, because outside variables will cause more fluctuation than any actual gain in strength or muscle. Variables like sleep and diet have short-term effects, and strength built from increased muscle mass is only noticeable long-term. I used to think that if I ever did less volume or less weight in a session, I would actually lose muscle mass, not even just not make progress. I used to think I'd lose muscle. So this sounds crazy, and it's a mindset that a lot of people have because it's constantly pushed on us that we need to constantly be training harder than last time. Progressive overload is the end all be all, and that's the only thing you should focus on. And while these can be good messages at surface level, that's kind of all they're good for. So for those of you that are training hard and are training properly, which a lot of people following this channel are smart people. I know all of my clients have a pretty good idea of what they're doing. And I know a lot of you guys that even aren't my clients that just comment on these videos, you guys have legit programs and you know what you're talking about. So you guys don't have to worry about like the progressive overload focus and the focus on basically progressing from day to day. That's not something that you guys have to focus on because you're already training hard. That's the only thing that that's really useful for. The only thing that you should be using progressive overload for are just is basically just a reflection to make sure that you're training hard. If progressive overload isn't taking place in your training, there's probably something that you have to change. And if you have that training experience, it's pretty easy to reflect and kind of assess what's going wrong. Not everything's easy, but eventually you'll kind of figure out what isn't right, and you kind of know it just through your gut feeling. Like, you know if you're not doing enough volume, you know if you're not pushing your sets hard enough. This is stuff that you can figure out. So the solution to this is, let me say this. So getting stronger is a good thing, but it's only useful if it's used long term. You won't build enough muscle from session to session to actually increase strength in that short of a term. So use a method of progression that is good for hypertrophy and use that as one of your tools to measure muscular growth, but don't overvalue it relative to other variables such as body weight, progress photos, and measurements. So there's a skewed perception on what's the most important thing when it comes to training, and people will always, strength is the end all be all for everybody. It seems that way because that's our training. Like, our training is a reflection of the progress that we're making. But when you're focusing on trying to train harder than last time or beat yesterday's or last week's PRs, the other variables, like let's say you didn't sleep well, that's probably going to have like a 5 to 10% fluctuation in your strength or the amount of volume you can get in for that day, or the amount of reps you get, than actual muscle built from last session will have in your training. So you won't build enough muscle in one session to the next or 1 week to the next that you actually made any gains. If you get stronger in the next week, it might be a little adaptation from a new lift that you're doing. It could be that you slept better or ate more. Like, all of these little day-to-day and week-to-week progressions isn't necessarily an indicator of muscle growth at all, because the other variables, like your sleep, your diet, and that's pretty much it, or your recovery. If you had a couple days off, that's obviously a big helpful variable to get stronger from day to day. Those aren't indicators of muscle growth. That's just an indicator of how fresh you are that day. Building muscle month over month and year over year will reflect in your training and in the strength numbers that you have. So that should be the focus. Short term, it's basically just going to be other outside variables like your diet and your sleep, or how many off days you've had / recovery. That's going to affect what your training looks like and the progressions that you're hitting. So focus on accumulation. Don't worry about trying to beat last week. It will come over time. It will 100% happen as long as you're training properly. And I know training properly is more complex than a lot of people think, but it's definitely doable as long as you kind of know basically what you're doing. So I encourage you to learn as much as you can about training, nail all of your variables, nail your fundamentals, and then focus on accumulating high quality volume. Take your sets close to failure. Get enough volume in. Get a good amount of exercise selection. Get enough reps, enough sets. It's stuff that we all kind of learn throughout our basically training journey. So accumulate volume, get your sets in. I don't care if you're not progressing from day to day. That's totally fine. If you've gone 3 months and there's no progressions at all, that's probably a red flag. I would assess your training again and make sure everything's in check. But don't worry about those short-term progressions. Get your volume in, add it to that bag of training history, add it to that bag of volume, keep accumulating, keep building. That's the most important thing. And with that being said, I want you guys to end this video with the mindset of accumulating, and don't focus so much on the short-term progression. Leave that for the long-term assessments. But with that being said, I think that's pretty much all I have to say today. So thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions.